China authorities say they will provide zero-tariff treatment for 6 least developed economies here in Africa. Starting on Monday, 98% of the products from Angola, the Gambia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, Mali and Mauritania will be exempt from tariffs when getting into the Chinese market. Ideally, that's aimed at increasing the number of African countries that receive zero-tariff treatment to 27 by the end of the year. China also plans to expand its zero-tariff treatment to other least developed nations that do have diplomatic relations with it. Here's CGTN's Robert Nagila with the details.
Well, starting December 25th, 2023, China says it is exempting 98% of taxable products from 6 African countries, among them the Gambia, Mali and the Democratic Republic of Congo, from paying tariffs while accessing markets in China. What this basically means is that these countries will be able to export their goods to China without paying the duties associated with those particular products. Now, it is thought the areas targeted under this program are petroleum products, agricultural products, the mining sector, among other programs. It is a good thing for these countries because with the savings they make from this program, that money could be diverted to other areas such as health and education. And it's not the first time that China is doing this. In December 2022, China exempted taxable products from 9 African countries, covering about 9,000 products. A perfect Christmas for these countries, but more importantly, an indication of just how strong the ties between China and Africa are, and the push by China to provide a market for goods from Africa. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
All right, then, so worth pointing out the wider economic context in which these reductions are taking place. The tariff reduction plan essentially aligns with Beijing's plan to boost a lot more agricultural imports coming into China from African economies, as outlined by the country's president Xi Jinping during the 8th ministerial conference of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The goal is to increase China's imports from Africa to at least $100 billion a year from 2022 to $300 billion a year by 2035. Data from the country's General Administration of Customs in August indicated that trade flows between China and Africa had gotten up to $156.4 billion in the first 7 months of the year. That's 7.4% higher than the same period a year earlier. Between January 1st and the 31st of July 2023, China's exports to African countries went up by 20% to around $97.8 billion. Over the same period of time, Chinese imports from Africa amounted to $58.6 billion. The authorities in China are saying that they will essentially provide zero-tariff treatment to at least 98% of imports derived from at least 6 least developed African economies. And that includes Angola, the Gambia, the DRC, Madagascar, Mali and Mauritania. But how exactly will these economies benefit from this change in tax policy? Let's explore that in a bit more detail. Nyang Omarjie is an economist. He's joining us from Banjul, capital of Gambia. It's one of the 6 countries, of course, that are benefiting from this round of tariff cuts. Thank you for your time this evening, sir. So let's start with the situation in Gambia. The country exported goods worth $47 million to China in 2021, and exports have been growing up to that point by double digits, in some cases by as much as 20% a year. So what export opportunities and growth and investment opportunities does this tariff cut offer to Gambia?
Thank you so much. I think what we're currently seeing in China is reminiscent of what we've seen with the AGOA. That's the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act that the US provided for African countries about 10, 15 years ago. However, I mean, if you look at the trade between Africa and China, Gambia to be precise, we exported quite a lot of wood to China. And basically there's zero value addition to it. And that is not something, African countries are expecting vis-a-vis economic deals and trade tariff deals that we want to have with China. We want to add value added in terms of processing some of the raw materials going to China on land in Africa before sending it to China. So we want to send semi-finished products and finished products rather than sending raw materials, because Africa has been sending raw materials for 60 to 70 years and it hasn't really grown the economy. So we want to add value to the valuable raw materials we are.
Indeed. So let's talk about Mali, for example, right next door to where you are. Cotton is one of their big exports. They sent about $93 million of it, worth $93 million worth of cotton to China. And a third of that, essentially, sorry, $93 million in total, a third of that went into the Chinese market. You're making the case for investment in processing in these countries. But does this tariff cut go far enough to make it competitive?
Well, I think the tariff cuts are competitive. The labor cost in Africa is quite competitive. And right now, Africa is having an emerging young group of people who are highly educated and can provide the skills, the requisite skills needed to supply industries with the skill set to do processing. But notwithstanding, I believe it's a good start, but that's not where we want to find ourselves. Where we want to find ourselves is we want to add value in the raw materials we have, rather than doing what we've been doing post-independence to date in terms of sending raw materials and receiving it again as finished goods. It hasn't helped the African lot at all over the past 60 to 70 years.
So what then should these countries be thinking about in order to move up the value chain? Because, you know, you look at the sort of goods that are being sent across the Indian Ocean, a big chunk of that is agricultural commodities, right? And these tend to have, you know, they're susceptible to adverse weather. We're having a lot more of that. The capital that you need to essentially scale the production of these goods over time may not necessarily be easily available. What should governments be doing to move up that value chain?
Well, I think it's a two-pronged approach. One, the industrialized world need to really make trade more balanced and fair. And in so doing, I think it's high time their entrepreneurs, their public policy directives start looking at investing in Africa to make sure that Africa will be competitive. Africa cannot be competitive because we don't have the prerequisite economies of scale in terms of labor and industrial capital expenditure. So what we're looking at is if the world, the global world itself, is interested in the development of Africa, it should not be an extractionary relationship whereby Africa produce material at its rawest stage. We want Africa to be producing inputs into manufacturing, processing, but at least for a start at a semi-processing level, whereby we add a little bit of value. Case in point, China has been importing wood from the Gambia for over 15, 18 years. And that wood comes back to Gambia in terms of finished furniture. So why can't China have factories that process this redwood in Africa and sell this furniture back in Africa? That's what's going to grow the African economy. And that's what's going to lead Africa to prosperity and take us out of the abject poverty many of us find ourselves in as countries.
Shouldn't the onus be on African economies and African policymakers to essentially make that investment themselves? Because the current arrangement essentially works for these economies that are importing their inputs, right, from Europe, from the United States, from China. They literally have zero incentive to try and change that economic relationship because right now it works for them. So shouldn't the onus be on us to get that change?
Well, you're quite right in the sense that in life, nobody gets what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. But unfortunately, Africa is not on an equal footing. We're not negotiating with an equal partner. Even if you take the continent as a whole, we don't negotiate deals, whether it be with the WTO, the US, China, or whoever has come in with enough equity. But I think there's a moral obligation on the world, particularly China being the fastest growing economies in the world, and also the supermarket of the world. China has a moral responsibility to see that equity and growth is, spread all over the world rather than being concentrated, because we have seen that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with Europe, and Asia for a good part have done well, and they were only able to do that because numbers was on their size. But in our case, the Gambia, size is a disadvantage. Therefore, the partnerships we want is to have partnerships that are win-win, but at the same time happens to have a moral link put into the policy matrices that are going to be set so that Africa wins, China wins, and we have a better, equitable, and a prosperous world.